We're afraid of what people will think, or we're afraid we're not good enough, or we're afraid we're too much. And so we hold ourselves back. When we do that, we're muting ourselves. And there are too many people that are muting themselves in the world. And I, for so many years, was one of them. I've discovered the power of unmuting myself, of showing up in the world in a way that is joyfully expressed and boldly alive. That's something that has been so important to me as I've discovered how freeing it is to be unmuted, to unmute our body and to unmute our ideas and to unmute our desires, to unmute ourselves in relationships and at work, and to be our own advocates and to ask for what we want and need. The unmuted life is a life that is fully alive and fully expressed and confident and clear. And to me, it's the only way that I know how to live now. I know what it's like to feel confined and stuck and small and silenced. And I also know what it feels like to be expressed and alive and joyful and present and seen. And it's so much better of a life to be unmuted. And that is what I want to bring you into. Are you ready to unmute yourself? Let's make it happen. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Rachel Druckenmiller here, the host of the show Unmute Yourself. I am so excited to be kicking off the year with you with our guest today. I have been following her work for, at this point, almost going on 5 years. And I know that you are going to get so much out of the conversation that we're going to have. I was really bummed to have to cancel the show at the end of 2023 because I got sick and lost my voice, and certainly could not sing a dozen songs with that situation going on. So thank you for your grace as I did the replay show from the year before. But I know that this year is going to be a really awesome year, and that we're going to be having some really meaningful conversations that are going to help give you a greater sense of courage and confidence, a sense of compassion for yourself and each other, and a greater ability to live in a way that's more fulfilling and that's more alive. Let us know where you're joining us from in the chat. We always like to hear that. Welcome to Carla and to Rich and to Toby. It's so great to see some familiar faces here, and I know that we'll have some new people joining us as well. And of course, these episodes are all recorded. So if there's something that you missed, you want to go back, you want to share with your colleagues, you want to share with a friend, a loved one, you can always go back and pull the episode after the show is finished, and you will be able to see the full thing at that point. Liam. Liam, so good to have you here from Raleigh, North Carolina. Love your enthusiasm. Liam's another person who how long have we been connected? Several years. And I know that the work you share is always so meaningful. Madison from Minneapolis, good morning. Good to have you here. I know that you are going to get a lot out of this conversation, and I know that you're going to want to share it with your organization, given the work that you do in the wellness space. And this is such an important conversation. Inclusion and belonging it's so connected to that. And so I know that this is going to be a meaningful conversation for that reason for you. Liam says 2 of my faves. So Mita, we already have fan club here. Grateful to have, let's see, someone joining us from Alberta. Welcome. Packer territory. We know my husband's a Packers fan. Rich, we share that love. And Rich is just one of the most thoughtful, kind, intentional humans and leaders that I know. And if you're not already connected to him, I would highly encourage that. Deb, welcome from Indianapolis. Good to have you here. So today I want to kick off the conversation. First of all, mention a couple of updates. If you haven't already heard it, the latest song, Light Bulbs, came out at the end of November, and it's a song that is meant to encourage you to reach out to the people in your life that may seem to be shining brightly all the time, that maybe they always have a smile on their face, but to really be thoughtful about maybe there's something behind it that we're missing. And so to be intentional about checking on and reaching out to the people in our lives that we often take for granted or that we often overlook. Just a reminder to do that. And welcome Haley from snowy Kansas City. So wanted to mention that. Another thing exciting, I'm working on a relaunch of my website, total rebrand. I have a photo shoot on Tuesday, and you all are the first to hear this here. I have not shared this publicly yet, but on Thursday, I'm recording a music video for light bulbs. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm like, let's just do this because it would be fun. So that's happening on Thursday. More to come on that. And I've also been working on my book and have heard back from 2 publishers so far. We want to have additional conversations about it. So lots of exciting things to kick off the momentum and energy of 2024. So to tee up the conversation we're about to have, I always like to start with a kickoff question. And so the kickoff question today is kind of broad. It's going to sound like something really broad. We know that all of us want to feel like we fit in. We want to feel included. We want to feel like we belong. We want to feel like, as Mita often says, that we are seen, heard, and recognized. And so what I would like to ask you to do is just to drop the first name of someone in the chat, or even their initials if you prefer, of someone who's made you feel included at any point in your life. Someone who has made you feel included, someone who's made you feel like you belong. When I think of this, one of the first people that comes to mind is my elementary school math teacher, Miss Schriefer. I went to a Catholic school growing up and I was not Catholic. And so I always had this sense of being different because everyone went to their first communion class and I sat in the classroom alone and did crafts by myself, or everyone made their confirmation in 8th grade and I had to sit in the classroom by myself where everyone went to classes for weeks and weeks at a time. And I was very aware of the fact that I was different and I was not the same as all the other people that I was in school with. And so when someone really took the time to pay attention to me and to bring me in and to ask me questions about myself and to affirm and encourage me, it meant so much because I often did not feel included by my peers. So Miss Schriefer was one. Jill, good to have you here. So let us know in the chat. You can just drop either the initials if you want to. That's probably the easiest way to do it. Initials or just the first name to just like think of. And maybe if you're still connected to this person, I would encourage you after the show to maybe send them a text and let them know how much you appreciate how they have shown up for you, how they have made you feel included. Someone who's made you feel included or like you belong. Feel free to drop that in the chat if you'd like, or just think about it to yourself. Quietly reflect on that. I think we can go through our lives and not ever pause to recognize the people who have created spaces where we feel like we can be ourselves, or where we feel accepted, or where we feel seen, heard, recognized, or valued. And I think a lot of us go through our lives just on autopilot and we can miss that. So let this be an encouragement to you to reach out. Rich says, my former supervisor, Kevin, made everyone feel valued and included in the way he led, modeling my leadership style after some of his traits. And I'm sure people are modeling leadership style after how you lead, Rich. You are someone who's so intentional too. So and I hope this is a catalyst for you to reach out, to text this person, to message this person, to email them, to call them, to thank them for how they have shown up and how they have made you feel included and like you belong. We've got Dan Jones, professor at Penn State, former colleague and friend Rita, always thinking about including people on our team and in our organization. So again, this is I think a helpful practice for us to engage in, especially at the start of the year, to really consider, and how can we be that person for somebody else? How can we notice someone who's excluded? How can we be the type of person who reaches out and connects and initiates and is genuinely curious and shows that care and compassion? So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our guest today. So Mita Mallick is a corporate change maker with a track record of transforming business. She has had an extensive career as a marketer in the beauty and consumer product goods space, being a fierce advocate of including and representing Black and Brown communities. Her book, which I would highly recommend you get, this is a must-have guide for humans, not just for leaders. Any human being who wants to learn how to feel more connected to other people in a genuine, meaningful way should get this book. Her book, Reimagine Inclusion, Debunking 13 Myths to Transform Your Workplace, is a Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller. And I think it just came out, October? Is that right, Mita? I think it came out in October?
Yes.
If I'm remembering release date correctly, or when
October 3rd, yes.
October 3rd. I pre-ordered it on Amazon, so I
Awesome.
ordered it well before. And so I'll just mention, Mita's also the co-host of a popular podcast, Brown Table Talk, part of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. The way that you and Dee Marshall talk to each other in the conversations you have, and it's such an enlightening and entertaining podcast, I would say. So I think everyone should check that out. And it includes stories and tips for how women of color win at work, and advice for allies and how they can show up. You have so many incredible accolades, including being a LinkedIn top voice, contributor for Harvard Business Review, Adweek, Entrepreneur, Fast Company. You've been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, Forbes, Axios, Essence, Business Insider, and we are so incredibly thrilled that you are joining us for this conversation today, Mita. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. This was many months in the making, and I feel included because Liam shouted me out. So I'm excited that Liam's here. Thank you for being here, Liam.
Isn't it great? Like when you feel like feeling wanted is like
yes. And there's many other people. I'm sure. Thank you all for being here. I just know Liam and saw his name, and it was...
Yeah, welcomed with enthusiasm. There's something about that that's like, oh, I guess I'm okay being here. Like,
yes, exactly.
I can take up space, and I can show up. So to kick off the conversation today, we always like to start by asking, our guests to share a story about a way that they've muted themselves or felt muted, because it could be really one or the other. Sometimes they're, certainly connected, and a journey that you've gone on to unmute yourself. And you can start wherever you want to start and end wherever you want to end. And you can tell us one or more stories. The floor is yours.
That's a powerful question. I have been on a journey to unmute myself. And I think our stories are constantly being rewritten. So there are moments where we unmute and mute and unmute. One of the stories that I share now publicly that is not in the book, maybe it'll be in the next book, but I talk about my origin story. I am the proud daughter of Indian immigrant parents. My younger brother and I were born and raised in the US. I grew up outside of Boston. I grew up in a time and a place where it was not cool to be Indian. I always joke about being, the funny looking dark-skinned girl with a long, funny looking braid whose parents spoke funny English until it wasn't funny anymore. And one of the stories that was really pivotal growing up was I was a freshman in high school. I was at a new school. And for some reason, I was being targeted by two white boys. They decided that it would be fun to bully me. And I had a braid down to my knees, and they would find me in the hallways and they would grab it like I was a horse and go, nay, and pull it. One of them sat behind me. So if I didn't pass the papers back fast enough, he would hold my head back against the desk. And this was in an intro to physical lab, to chemistry, intro to physical sciences, which I was really excited about. And it was in that lab portion, I think it was like 8 weeks into the class, they decided to set my hair on fire. And they were behind me and were lighting matches and throwing them into my hair. And my lab partner hadn't spoken to me in this entire time. I was new to the school. And the first, I think, thing she said to me is, I think your hair is on fire. And I'll tell you, Rachel, to this day, that's the smell of burnt hair, like if accidentally it gets in the hairdryer, that memory brings me back. But also I have a fear, people who know me and don't know the story have a fear of lighting candles. I don't like to be around matches or fire, and I wonder if it's from that. But my hair is clearly fine now, but the damage to my psyche was pretty deep. And what happened that day was really interesting. I was called into the principal's office like I had done something wrong along with those two boys. They never called my parents. Now, my hair was long enough that parts of it were burned, and I never actually told my parents what had happened. They never called them. They were suspended for a day, and they were brought back into the classroom with me. And I was unsafe, felt terrorized for the rest of that year. But why I share this story is, you asked me about a time I was muted, and that significantly, I think, impacted the rest of my high school experience of how I showed up. But also what I find very interesting about this situation is that analogy, or I would say the literal setting my hair on fire, is also happening in our workplaces today. So while in the years since then, I have Googled those bullies to see what they're doing, like we would Google ex-partners and ex-friends, I asked myself the question, where were the parents? Where was law enforcement? Where was everyone else who could have intervened? And I have a story later of someone who did intervene and help, but that's what's happening in our workplaces. When someone doesn't feel like they're included, when you see someone who is being targeted, are we just watching bystanders, or are we going to intervene and do something and say something?
That story, I can almost like smell what you're talking about, that and can imagine how incredibly triggering that would be, and the amount of healing, the amount of work that like you would have to do as a result of being subject to all of these things that were not your choosing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's trauma. Like these are, I mean, certainly trauma. I know Gabor Mate says trauma isn't what happens to us. It's what we tell ourselves about what happens to us. But I mean, I don't know what other story you could tell yourself about that, you know? And when you think back to that experience, how do you move on from that? How do you not just get completely paralyzed by that, by something like that happening? Because that could be an option, right? Like you have something like that happen, you cannot physically get out of bed in the morning and even show up at school the next day. I mean, how did you move through that?
I growing up had two parents and a brother who loved me and supported me. And so having that at home made a really big difference versus what was happening outside. I also, not surprising, love to read and write. So like reading and writing in books was my sanctuary. I didn't have a lot of friends growing up, but I certainly had lots of books and my imagination. And so it's just all of that pushed me forward to keep on going. Yeah. And I know that's true for anyone who's experienced different levels of trauma. And I'm not here to compare pain, right? Everyone's been through different things, but it is the human spirit, right? We're just resilient, and there's another day and we get up and we move forward. But I think if I can say this, which sounds very strange, having gone through that, is that there is a gift in that, because I do think that helped me develop my empathy, which I'm on a journey to continue developing, but also just to be more aware of things that are happening. Because I was quite an enthusiastic student, but because of what was happening in my surroundings, I was muted. And so if anyone was observing that, they might have seen that and intervened. And so I ask for anyone who's watching today, like if you're in your workplace and somebody who used to be enthusiastic for work or used to show passion in whatever way they do suddenly has gone quiet or seems really disinterested or disengaged, ask yourself, are you checking in on them? Like what's happening there? Like we all have a responsibility to do that. You don't have to be the CEO to do that.
No.
Right? You don't have to be the CEO to do that.
You just have to be a human who cares and who's attentive and attuned, really.
Absolutely.
To notice. There's something what you just said reminded me of something I heard Simon Sinek say. One time he was describing the story of somebody coming in, having an issue with performance at work. And so person goes into manager A's office and manager A says, your numbers are down for the third quarter in a row. If you don't get your act together, there's going to be serious consequences, right? Like threat, manager A, threat.
Sure.
Manager B, same employee, same challenge. The employee goes in, the manager says, your numbers are down for the third quarter in a row. Is everything okay? It's the difference between, and I love how he frames it. He says the person is a problem versus the person has a problem.
Absolutely.
And that's often what we're doing, right? Is we're saying like, this person is the problem. It's like, no, that person, they don't feel seen, safe, heard, recognized, valued. Yeah. Like that's the challenge, right? And someone mentioned too, this is happening in schools, right? I mean, like,
absolutely. It is. And I have to tell you now with children, that story hits differently. I get more emotional because I don't see myself in it anymore. I see my children and other people's children in it. And that's actually what hurts me more than my own experience.
Do you mind me asking how that affects the way that you parent? Because I know there's a lot of parents that watch the show and they're always like, how can I have my child? You know, I'm curious. It's a loaded question. That could be like an hour, just that.
It could be an hour. I'll come back to that. It is. You have to be careful not to helicopter parent in that moment because of I cannot pass my trauma onto them. And my parents unknowingly did that because they were immigrants and they knew nobody when they came to the US. And so they were constantly in survival mode. So a lot of the ways I operated in corporate America in my career, a show for another time, was constantly feeling like I was in survival mode, but I'm trying not to pass that trauma onto them. But what I would say is, and I talk about this in Reimagine Inclusion, is that this work does not start in our conference room tables. It doesn't start in our boardroom tables. Inclusion starts at our kitchen tables. It starts at our homes and our communities. And so with my children, I watch for language and I watch for the language I use. Mita is weird, funny, strange, stupid, lazy, smells. No one really likes her, Mom. Okay, tell me more. What does that mean? Because that starts othering and stereotyping, which becomes the gateway to hate. And I know I'm fast forwarding real fast, but I'm talking about how these things start. and how the seeds are planted is that when we perceive a difference, right? You perceive something different about me, you start to say things like, she's funny or weird. And you're like, well, tell me more about that. And so let's watch for that language and how we talk about others. And I watch for that with my kids as well, as much as I can.
Starting with curiosity. The curiosity is noticing without judging, right? It's like asking that question in a thoughtful way. And Liam's calling that out, but both of them, both Liam and Lisa, welcome, right? Inclusion starts at our kitchen tables. And, you know, let me see. Oh, there's a distinct difference. Oh, sorry, in volume. Are you hearing me okay?
I can hear you. Yes.
Yes. Not too loud. Okay.
You're not muted.
Just one. Hey, that's good. But you understood the assignment.
Yes. Yeah.
I did underline that line in the book. It's on page 2. Inclusion doesn't. It is the sentence I underline on that page. Oh. Inclusion doesn't start at the conference room tables. It starts at our kitchen table. So I was like, I know where this is going.
And so that to me is fascinating because we've spent my book is already out of date. That's how books go in statistics. But at the time I said we had spent $8 billion on diversity, equity, inclusion training alone in this country. And now we see the backlash that's happening. But in so many ways, it's like, you just can't expect me, Mita, to show up at work and suddenly, I'm an inclusive leader. That's not how it works. There's so much work that happens outside of the office that people have to really think about. Because I can be working for you, Rachel. You can be the CEO. I'm your CMO. And guess what? There's diversity of representation on my team. Your next question should be, is Mita fit to lead the team? Right? Am I fit to lead that team? And am I on a journey to continue to upskill myself to be an inclusive leader?
Well, and something you talk about with that also is looking at your own community, right? Like in the book, you talk about look at your friendships, look at the people you spend time with, look at the people that you're engaging with, the activities you're doing. Does everyone look exactly the same as you? You know, are you really truly, is this just a checkbox? Or are you truly making intentional changes in your life to become part of a more inclusive community and to create that around yourself? Or are you just saying like, I did the thing, I checked the box, like next, you know?
Absolutely. And I think in our world today, there's absolutely no excuse for not being able to build more cross-cultural relationships. I'll never forget, I include this in Reimagine Inclusion, but working in Vermont quite a bit, which if you're in the US, you may know it's statistically 98% white. So a leader in Vermont would bellow at me and be like, what do you want me to do? Move. I'm like, no, I'm not saying to move, but look, I met Liam. He's in North Carolina. I'm in New Jersey. You and I were connected through LinkedIn. Like there's just, whether it's LinkedIn or other social media platforms, you can create an amazing community and you can get to meet people that you normally wouldn't based on where you live. So I don't think we have that excuse anymore.
I would agree with that. And I one of the things I think is interesting when you were talking about how your previous experiences have shaped who you've become and the work that you do and the focus and intention behind, purpose behind really what you do now, to me, it strikes me that you experienced a lot of rejection growing up.
Yes.
And so when you go through the process of doing something like, and I want to unpack some of the specific strategies and tips and insights in the book as well, because I think that will be really helpful for everyone here. And I know people, if you don't already have a pen, like grab a pen, because there's going to be some already been wisdom dropped, more is coming. As I think about the journey and people hear about someone's writing a book,
yes,
like the amount of like how hard that is. If you could take us through what this journey has been like to get this to come into the world.
It is hard. Let me tell you, Rachel, I am not an overnight success. Social media will have you think otherwise, but I am not. And I'm not the person, now that you're going through the book process, you might have heard of this. Some of you listening might have heard of this. There's things called auctions. Sometimes like manuscripts and books are so popular that like many houses want them. That was not my case. I started writing this book. I wrote it 4 years ago. I'm going to tell you, it was the longest road to get this published, but some of the highlights included when I finally found an agent. She worked with me for 3 months and actually gave me lots of great insight and feedback and helped me shape the book, then decided that she couldn't represent me, that she wasn't the best person to represent me. So that's rejection 1. I finally find an agent, Josh Getzler of HU Literary. He's amazing. He's not accepting clients right now. So sorry, but it's a great, great agency. And we went out with the book and I got feedback like, come back to me when she has a book more like Sheryl Sandberg. there's a lot of people who look like Mita writing books like this. So coming very close to deals, but people saying there's too many like me writing on this topic. And then comments like, well, Mita's writing is amazing. She's a masterful storyteller, but she has no followers. Who's going to buy this book? So there's no like market for it. And just like many of you have a rainy day folder, I hope you do. If you don't, create a rainy day folder. It's all the love notes people send you. So when you have a crappy day, you go look at it. I have a rejections folder. I think it's over 40. I don't remember, because my agent would send me all the details. And Rachel, what I was looking for was feedback on the writing. And the world has changed. There was not much feedback on the writing, but there was feedback on all kinds of other things. And then on this road to rejection, I actually got a book deal. I was close to getting a book deal from a top 10 publishing house, and then they rescinded the offer. And the way I find out is my agent didn't get to me in time. So like on Monday morning, I got a note from the editor on LinkedIn saying, nice to connect here. I'm sorry my boss wouldn't. Again, it was the boss who said, I know you want to sign her, but we have too many books similar to this, after a lengthy, like multiple week process. So at this point, I'm in my bed eating Cheetos. Like I am depressed and crying. And my good friend Lan Fan, who you should have on your show, she's coming out with a book. She's the CEO and founder of Community of Seven. And she said to me, just do what you do well, which is you love community conversation and writing. Then the podcast starts. I start a podcast with DC Marshall called Brown Table Talk. We self-fund it. LinkedIn comes in and says, we love the podcast. Will you join our network? We said yes. And then I'm just continuing to do the work of what I enjoy doing. And it was one day that Dee reaches out to me and says, Wiley wants to talk to you because she has a book deal with Wiley. And her editor was interested in meeting me and said, your co-host sounds amazing. Does she have a book deal? So I share that all. And there's much more I didn't share. But to let you all know that these things don't happen overnight. I've been writing as long as my mother said, could pick up a crayon and try to write. And so you don't let your dreams die. You just keep going after them.
Oh, wow. That's congratulations on that. I mean, and this comment here is related to what we were talking about before from Lisa, or the more relationships I have with people from diverse backgrounds, cultures, and perspectives, the more I've grown and learned.
Absolutely.
About ourselves, about the world, about what it is to be human, about, experiences that we may never have that somebody else has had. And so, as I think about your story of the book, that's so interesting that you started writing it as long ago as you did. And someone would look at you now, just, on LinkedIn and with all the accolades I read at the beginning and be like, geez, if that person can get a book deal, like who the heck can get a book deal? How did you, and you kept the rejection folder, how did you encourage yourself? Because all of us deal with rejection of different kinds, whether it's social, whether it's professional, whether it's, so curious, were there certain things that you did that helped you to stay hopeful?
I just kept writing. I love it so much. Why do I love LinkedIn? For many reasons, but I love it also because most of what performs well on LinkedIn is the written form, at least for me. I mean, I do love video, I do love audio, but I love writing and I love storytelling. And I started to break into outlets like Harvard Business Review and Fast Company and Entrepreneur, and I started writing for them. And I just knew, I was like, there's an audience, people are reading it. And I knew it would come. And so I just didn't give up. But it was also like the discipline of continuing to write, right? There's, some people will say, it's like, manifest, right? Like, go and manifest. It's not like I'm manifesting from my couch. I mean, yeah, I'm sitting on my couch sometimes, but I'm also like doing the daily work to get the book or whatever I'm trying to bring out into the world to make that happen. So the discipline piece is key. But it is also, I will say, the biggest upgrade of my life is like having an amazing community around you who believes in you. Yeah. Your friends and family who will just say, yeah, this is going to happen for you. Don't give up. And we're here cheering for you. That means a lot.
Yeah. A little love from Mark saying love knowing what both of you are doing in the world. Mark and I, gosh, we ran into each other at I don't know how many different conferences where I was speaking, where his team was, supporting it. And so it's always cool when that kind of thing happens. Liam, I love me some manifestation. That's really funny. So, as I think about, there's so much here. There's so much about sponsorship. There's so much here about having those courageous conversations. Like one of the things you talked about, that story that you shared, I'm not going to tell that. You can tell a snippet of it if you'd like, but I would encourage everyone to get the book. But just the kind of things that happen from the companies that you have, consulted with,
Yeah.
that have come to you and said like, well, we need to have a conversation. Let's get like this one Black person in our company in to see what they think about it, and sort of check the box to say that we did that. And I'm curious, how can we have more courageous conversations? How can we facilitate more courageous conversations? How can we initiate more courageous conversations at work? Anything you want to share about that? Because I think there's a need for that right now more than ever.
Don't put the burden on Black and brown people to lead courageous conversations. I mean, I say this in Reimagine Inclusion. I've been having courageous conversations on race since the day I was born. I didn't have the privilege being born in this country looking the way I do. It was always just a topic of conversation, whether I wanted it to be or not. Mm-hmm. And so, the interesting thing about storytelling, right? It's like one of the oldest forms of communication in human civilization. And so everyone loves a good story. It can move people, it can inspire change, it can transform individuals' lives and organizations. But stop and ask yourself, what's the price you want to pay to get a story from a primary source? Mm. So for example, and I share this in the book, if another Black unarmed Black American is shot and killed by law enforcement, and you, as someone, say, I am on a journey to be an ally to the Black community. I say journey, there's no allyship card, right? The only people who can tell you is if I'm showing up for that community is the community. So my Black friends and colleagues could tell you, yes, Mita is or isn't. They're the only ones that could let you know that. But imagine if I go to the only Black person in the office who I don't really have a relationship with and ask them, like, what do you think about what just happened? Like, how do you feel about it? Similar to the Asian community. There's another Asian hate crime, and you go up to the only person in the office and ask them how they feel. And you're doing that because you want to educate yourself, but you don't realize the burden you're putting on them, and you don't realize potentially the intergenerational trauma that they've experienced. And so that's why Google is your best friend. Mm-hmm. There are so many books and resources where, as an ally, you can educate yourself. And if you are going to have these conversations at work, hopefully you have a chief diversity officer or someone who can help construct them with care. Mm-hmm. So there's both allies involved and individuals from the communities who are impacted who want to be involved in the conversation as well.
Yeah, and when you think of some specific strategies, I know you talked about checking in, and I think it was in chapter Myth 3, I think it was in.
Yes.
Is that what it was, right? Am I getting this right?
It is, yes. You studied the book. Yes, it is.
A little bit. There was some specific, the team check-in, one-on-one check-in message. How are you doing today? Entering these, like the importance of listening, not inserting not trying to like one up somebody or try to feel like you're connected by being like, oh, I had the same thing happen. No, you didn't. So tell us more about some of those. Could you unpack some of those strategies a little bit?
And I give really practical strategies in Reimagine Inclusion because I've had so many people over the years ask me, like, how do you do this? Mm-hmm. And so if you are somebody who verbally isn't as comfortable, you could always send a text or Slack. I saw this in the news. I'm thinking of you. Just let me know if I can do anything, right? We said this at the beginning. We're talking about inclusion. Inclusion in the workplace. People want to feel valued for their work, but you also want to be seen. Yeah. So part of it is if something catastrophic has happened in my community and I show up at work and no one says anything about it, it makes me feel like I'm invisible, that I don't belong here. Yeah. And so that one message. And so what I always say is like, don't wait for the CEO to send a note. I'm not saying that's unimportant, but that's sort of game over. We're all leaders. We should all be checking in on each other. Mm-hmm. And so that's so important. And then the other thing I wanted to share, which you brought up, is this idea of if Rachel and I are in conversation and I go to her, well, actually, I won't put Rachel in the hot seat. Rachel comes to me to share something that's happened in the workplace that she's very upset about. And she's been the target of something. My job is not to be an investigative journalist. Why, what, who, when, where? Oh, I think you're being too sensitive. I don't think that person meant it that way. Or I actually know that person and I don't think they would ever do that. Maybe you should grow thicker skin. Maybe you're just overthinking this, right? So like, how does that make you feel? We've broken any sort of psychological safety or trust we've had because you came to me thinking that you could trust me with this information. And I think part of it is that we're programmed, at least I have been in corporate America, to be a problem solver. So you automatically want to jump into like solving this problem. And there's nothing to solve except to hold space and listen and say, thanks for trusting this information. What can I do to help you? How can I help support you now? Perhaps having a follow-up conversation. But isn't that hard to sit in uncomfortable silence? And that's actually a lot of sometimes what the work is in these conversations.
Yeah. It really is. And just that creating a space to be present and listen without having an agenda. Like people can tell when you have an agenda, when you're stepping into a conversation. Yes. And it's like, okay, like I remember I had a friend that texted me in May of 2020 after George Floyd was killed. And she was like, oh, I have this Black friend from like some time ago. Like, should I reach out to him? Like, if you don't already have like some type of a foundational relationship with this person, like don't create more noise by like trying to feign something that isn't there. You know what I mean? Like, so I'm curious because sometimes there's a concern, I think, for a lot of people of, I want to reach out. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to mess it up. I don't want to further cause more of an issue. And so I'm just going to say nothing.
And that is saying something when you say nothing, isn't it? Listen, here's the thing. Allyship is going to cost you something. It'll cost you your pride. It'll cost you your comfort. You will say the wrong thing. You will be embarrassed. Of course, I've done that. Right? You will, but that's part of growing and learning. Yeah. And even to send a message I sent, I'm not sure what to say. I just want you to know I'm thinking of you, and I've been watching the news, and I'm here if I can do anything. Yeah. And even to say, I know we haven't talked in quite a long time. Yeah. But you're just on my mind. And if it's coming from the heart and it's genuine, right? And that you're checking in and you're caring, that's going to be received well. Yeah. Versus when you overthink or you're trying to, use words or insert things that you don't really understand, just from the heart to say, that's actually really interesting one. Rachel, I haven't talked to you in a year, but I saw this happen. I saw it's in your hometown, and I'm just thinking of you. Yeah. And I wanted you to know. And if there's anything I can do, feel free to please call me. Yeah.
It does make a difference. And even something that, I mean, people have done stuff like that. If there's like a hurricane that comes through somewhere, a tornado, right? Where someone's like, oh my gosh, were you affected by this? It's like, we do that with weather. Weather feels safe. But other topics don't feel safe.
Well, it feels political, as people would say. And I always say when, many leaders over the years will say to me, well, this is too political, Mita. We can't talk about this. I can't address this as too political. And I always try to get people to think about, isn't it through the lens of privilege that we think something's political? So through my lens of privilege, I can think Black Lives Matter is political, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-LGBTQ legislation, Black Lives Matter. I can go on and on. But at the end of the day, it's about people being hurt and harmed, isn't it? Yeah. It's about people's lives are at stake. And then you start to think, well, this is why it's so important, the discussion we had at the beginning, because if I actually knew people from those communities, I would never say it's political, right? I would say, oh my God, I actually know my neighbor, my teacher, my cousin, I know somebody who identifies with this community and is personally being harmed. And then all of a sudden it hits really close to home, and then you would never use the word political, right? And that's when all these terms have been weaponized, right? When it's really just about like caring for each other and caring for individuals.
Yeah. It's like what's political is deeply personal.
Absolutely.
And, what are some of the biggest, and you write about myths, 13 myths in here, and I love that you write them so directly. I just really appreciate your style of writing. Like, just the way that you approach it is like, even the storytelling and the questions you can ask and the steps to take. I mean, it's very like, it's very action oriented, but also intended to stir up emotion, which I think the combination of those two things are the most effective. And anything that I like to
Thank you. I wish I had shown you this book 4 years ago, this proposal. Maybe you would have signed me if you were an editor.
Like, I can see it all here right now. Like, in the back, now that it's a Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller. But I just the flippant way that you approach like something. There was a comment about women. Like, of course we support women. We just extended maternity leave. I'm curious when you think of there's 13 myths that you talk about. If people could gain more insight, I mean, I think everyone should read the whole book. And just as a reminder, we're talking about, we're Mita Mallick here about Reimagining Inclusion. What are 2 or 3 that you think are the most important to start with when you think about the myths that are outlined in the book? I realize this is like, people know.
You're asking me to pick who my favorite child is.
Yeah.
What my kids do to me every day.
Or maybe 1 or 3 of your.
I'm gonna do. Why don't we do 2? I'll do
2.
I'll do the shout out for the first one because that's what we've been talking about. Myth 1, of course, I support Black Lives Matter. Why are you asking if I have any Black friends? As Rachel said, every myth is purposely tongue in cheek and clickbait. And the reason I did that was because if I was going to write a book, there's many good books on leadership and inclusion in the marketplace. I wanted to reach people in a different way. And that is the conversation we've just been having. Inclusion doesn't start at the conference room table. It starts at the kitchen room table, really thinking about who's in your community. And here's the thing. If I, Mita, and I'm not on a journey to be a more inclusive leader in my community and to try to build those cross-cultural relationships, how can I be expected to function differently at work? Like a 4-hour unconscious bias training isn't going to be like, poof, now I'm inclusive, right? And so that's something that I think is just a real shift in how we think about this work, really to think about the work that's happening outside of the office. Another myth that I had the courage to write, I had the courage to write all of these, but I was pleasantly surprised by the response I've been getting, which is myth 6. Why are you asking for a raise? You and your husband make more than enough money. And this one really gets to the heart of pay and equity. And the myth that I try to debunk is that white women and women of color don't negotiate. We actually do negotiate. And often when we do negotiate, we are gaslit, dismissed, and minimized. And the title of that chapter is a true story you can read about a former manager who gave me that feedback. And one of the things I want us to all think about is it's actually our relationship with money and our insecurities about money that we bring into the workplace. And when we're leading teams, that can be quite dangerous. So if I'll just pick on my friends, Rachel and Liam, if Liam comes and asks me for a raise and I think, oh yes, Liam, that's so great that you're asking for a raise. And I know you just expanded your family. Awesome. And then Rachel comes and asks me for a raise. Am I like, shouldn't she be grateful? Why is she asking me for more money? Like what? And so I do think a lot of these things are deep seated in the ways in which we've been raised and what we expect women to do versus men to do. And whether we realize that or not, it shows up in the workplace. Because I would argue many companies are quietly doing the right thing. They are actually, you might not know this, if you're working for a large Fortune 100, even private companies, they're doing pay and equity reviews. They're just not telling you, they're doing it. But it's really me, Mita, as a leader who shows up and wreaks havoc on the system. Because I decide who's going to get paid more or less based on my own biases that I'm not familiar with. But
yeah, I actually sat in a meeting with it was a large health insurance company. I was speaking at an event for them some time ago. And they actually shared updates about their like DEI metrics. And they talked about things like pay equity. They talked about percentage of people in positions of management and leadership. They talked about it regionally. I was like, wow, I've never seen a company be so like forthright about this to a group of leaders and saying, and these are the steps that we're taking.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was pretty eye-opening since I'd never been in a room and like heard something like that before.
The other thing I want to add, which is why it's important, it goes back to inclusion, is, you know, when I wrote this part of the book, one of the things I talked about was I don't have the privilege to wear a hoodie to work. I'm not Mark Zuckerberg. But then if I show up to work wearing my nicest logo bags and nicest shoes, then it's like, does she really need this job? She's just carrying a Birkin to work. She doesn't need this job. Why are we paying her so much? You know, and you're like, wow. So, okay, why does this matter? It goes back to the emotional tax. Yeah. And when I wrote this chapter, so many women actually were like, yeah, these are things that we think about too. Like I actually don't wear my nicest things to work, or I might decide to not wear my diamond ring to work, or all these sort of things. And you're like, wow. And so I go back to like, why is inclusion important? It's because if you hire me to give 100% of my genius at work. And guess what? Most days I'm only offering at 50 or 75% because I'm thinking about the environment and all these other things that are happening, and I'm not able to focus on the work. And that's why in the midst of a DE&I backlash, I go back to inclusion's about productivity. right? We go to work to get a paycheck, and some of us have found our purpose, but I want to be at work to be valued, seen, and recognized.
Yeah.
And I can't do that if I'm constantly wondering, like, you know, people say, how'd you get rid of your English? How do you get rid of your accent? Excuse me. How do you speak English so well? You changed your hairstyle today. Your lunch smells funny. You're taking up too much space. You're taking up not, like, think about all the things that some of us might go through every day. And it's like, I can't do the work. I'm focused on what comment might be coming next.
Yeah. Well, even I heard there's two stories I want to bring up. One that you mentioned on the podcast. I forget who you were talking about. It would have been a friend of yours or somebody that you were talking about who like parked really far away from like the main.
I did that.
Oh, you did that. Okay. And you intentionally did that and didn't show up with your nicest things.
Yeah.
Because of the concern of what other people
so
would think.
my husband's a big car person. I am not. At one point in our life, we had a BMW with one car. And so I was driving this to work one day. And I was mortified when I found out the VP had the same make and model. I parked it, Rachel, like 3 lots over. Oh my God. And I want to share another story that I talk about in the podcast. I was on the Tavis Smiley show. Please check his show out if you haven't. But he was saying when he was growing up as a part of a Black American church, somebody who was at the church had a Cadillac. And this gentleman would drive the Cadillac every Sunday. And it was a big deal for him to drive the Cadillac to the church to be a role model of what he had accomplished in his career. But Rachel, he never drove the Cadillac to work because he was afraid of being judged. So you're like, wow. So again, we're just talking about one story, but think of, and I know we all have these stories. We've all had moments where we haven't felt included, and imagine the amount of brain energy it takes.
Yes. It's a lot. It's I forget what book I was reading at one point, but they were saying it's like, it might have been Amy Cuddy or something, but talking about how the amount of energy that we expend trying to manage impressions and expectations and perceptions is so much energy that is then taken away from actually doing the work and performing and connecting and collaborating and innovating. And people don't think about that. Like if you've always felt like you are safe and comfortable, because really this is coming down to safety, right? You're talking about psychological safety. When you don't feel safe, your brain cannot access its highest level of creative and innovative thought. It cannot, because when you're in the running around in the wilderness trying to escape from a tiger, it's not like, oh, I wonder how we can be really, really creative right now. I wonder how we can innovate. It's like, how can we get away as fast as possible? And absolutely. I mean, I heard a story. I was talking to somebody I'm actually interviewing for my book, and she was sharing something that happened at work where you talk about this in the book about having credit taken from her for something that she did, and somebody totally stole her thunder, and somebody completely threw her under the bus. She was like, oh, I can share that and present that at the meeting, and then took full credit for it. And then when everything happened with George Floyd, this was like potentially, I want to say it was anywhere from 5 to 10. I realize that's a long time span. Years later, that when everything happened that May, the colleague reached out to her to say, I knowingly did this and I'm sorry.
Wow.
And she was like, so you knew all along what you were doing. Like you knew what you were doing and took that opportunity away. And she even talks about how walking around work, she's like, I get commented on if I'm not like, why wasn't I smiling? Like,
I get that. You need to smile. You know what? I just now smile all the time. I enjoy smiling. Life is good. But I also have had people early in my career, because if my resting face might look like I'm angry, I'm not. I'm just thinking. Yeah. But I get that a lot.
It's like you're being pensive and you're penalized. You're penalized for being pensive.
I'm penalized for thinking.
It's like, what in the world, And I mean, talk about the negotiating thing. My mom's a financial planner. Which is unusual because I think at this point, it's something like 11 to 13% of financial advisors are women. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up in a really unusual environment of having that influence. She's had her own business for 25 years. And she and my dad both started as teachers and did not have any model from anyone that they're related to becoming entrepreneurs. And because they did that sort of showed me that I could do that. And one of the greatest gifts my dad gave me is he used to teach negotiating. And so he taught me from the time I was in my early 20s how to negotiate for more money at work. And I'm actually writing about this. There's a section of my book where I'm writing about this because I've shared this with people and they're like, wait, give me the language. What's the language you use? I'm like, okay, I'm just going to write about it so that
that's amazing. Yeah.
The language. And it was basically, sneak peek. You're not going for a raise. you're going for a compensation adjustment to better reflect your increasing value and contributions. So you said you're never asking for a raise. You're asking for a comp adjustment, because usually by the time you're asking for more money, you've already been doing the work.
Yeah, it's just a adjustment. And Rachel, I agree, and I love that, and I can't wait to read that part of your book. And what I also would add is that sometimes some of us do that, and we're still dismissed and minimized.
Yeah. And what do you do if that's the case? Like, because I know that is the more common experience.
Yeah.
That someone is probably minimized, and there were times where I would say, is this possible? I would come up with a number and I'd say, is this possible here? And then they would say, every time they say yes, but maybe it took them a year and a half longer than I wanted it to, or, so I'm curious.
So my biggest piece of advice is, if your boss won't give you a raise, go find someone else who will. Your boss's peer, your boss's boss. Go find somebody else. What I always was bad at early in my career, Rachel, is I didn't realize the doors were closed and people were talking about my career. Like, doors are closed and people are talking about your career. And so figure out who those people are. Because your boss, I've had some really great bosses and some really not so great bosses. And so if you could figure out who else could advocate for you. I once did this. I went to an exec team. I knew one of the white men on the team. He was an executive. He and I were checking in, and I said to him, hey, can you tell me a little bit about how you negotiate and how you think about compensation? And so I got him to start talking about that. And then he said, well, how come you're asking me this question? And I said, well, here's the situation at work. And he was like, oh, okay, well, so send me these talking points. And, he was in that closed our conversation. And so he was able to advocate for me. He wasn't my boss though. And so start thinking about that. Start thinking about who else you can influence.
Sometimes you're talking to the wrong person.
Absolutely. Right? Yeah.
It's like, it may not be that it may not be that this is not possible here. It may not be that it's not possible here, as long as that person is the one that's determining whether it's possible.
Right. But here's the thing. You know your worth. And once you know your worth and you found it, don't let anyone question it. And so if you've tried enough within your current company, it's time to make a move. Go where you're celebrated and not tolerated.
Yeah. Agreed. And we've got a big amen from Kamau in the chat. I'm curious if there's any questions. So I know we have about 7 minutes left, and this conversation has flown by.
Only 7 minutes. Oh my goodness.
It's wild. I know it's I don't know how you cram so much into like 30 to 35 minute episodes in your podcast, but I realize this is, conversation. We're just connecting for the first time in this way. Would love to have you back. I feel like there's so much more to unpack.
Yes, I'll do a part 2.
That is fantastic. And so I'm curious if anyone has any questions as you think about, maybe some of the challenges that you've run into or situations that you face. If you have any specific questions for Mita, feel free to drop them in the chat. While we're waiting for that, one of the other things that you talk about your sponsor, Gail, and I know you talk about sponsorship extensively in the book. Curious about, how people can leverage sponsorship to help accelerate their career.
I mean, the quick of it is I have been over-mentored and under-sponsored in my career. Yes, I will say that again, as you all throw digital rotten tomatoes at me. I have been over-mentored and under-sponsored in my career. And here's what I mean by this. Like, mentorship is amazing. I wouldn't be here with Rachel today on her show without amazing mentors, but sponsorship looks different at work. Sponsorship for me is somebody who's typically has been 2 levels above me. They have political capital, skin in the game, big budget, oversee a big talent group. They're also at that table when decisions are being made about people's careers. And they are going to help me advance in my career in a way that a mentor likely won't be able to. Because Rachel and I could be mentors for each other after the show, but Rachel and I don't work in the same organization. It's different. And so you want somebody who has access to opening doors for you, giving you feedback on things that you're working on, getting you access to the C-suite, getting your name on a slate for a job that you didn't even know was going to open up, getting you in a special task force. And so those are the kinds of relationships I talk about in Reimagine Inclusion. And really the difference between mentorship and sponsorship, both are important. Sponsorship helps advance your career, I believe, more quickly.
So I'm hearing advocacy more so as a core thread to sponsorship versus mentorship.
And what I talk about in Reimagine Inclusion is it's like, listen, this isn't a Taylor Swift concert. We're not swapping friendship bracelets. It's not like you go up to someone and you're like, Rachel, will you be my sponsor? No, it's through the credibility of the work, right? So if Rachel's the CFO and I go to her and I have a coffee to say, hey, tell me about your career. How'd you become a CFO? that's a great conversation. It's a different conversation than me going to Rachel and saying, hey, Rachel, I'm actually working on reviewing all of the media investments we made in our division last year. And here's an analysis I did in the ROI, and I wanted you to see it and get some feedback. And Rachel's like, I didn't know you were working on that. That's really interesting. Rachel asked me 5 questions, asked me to come back. In 6 weeks, I come back, I've answered those questions. And Rachel's like, hey, could you come to my team meeting next week? I'd love, do you see the difference? So they're both valuable, but they're different. And so I spent too much of my career like this, not enough of my career looking up and around, thinking about who else should know about my work and how I could talk about the value of my work. And it's through the value of the work that you're building the relationship.
I agree. And I think something that I talk about, I call this doing an impact inventory of keeping track of all of the things that you have contributed.
Yes.
So that you have some record of that. So when the time comes to have these conversations to negotiate something, that you have something to stand on. But also something I would do in my career, I was the director of well-being for my company I worked at for 13 years. And I started as an intern, like answering phones and taking boxes to storage and picking up pizza. And I was like, I'm just happy to have a job. You know, like I'll do whatever you ask me to do. I never thought I would stay there as long as I did after interning for 4 years and then staying full-time for 13. You know, but one of the things that I would do is if I got an email from somebody that praised something that I had done, like, and it was very specific about a contribution I had made, I would take that email and I would forward it. It was a small company at the time. I think by the time I left, there were about 70 employees within the smaller group. And, you know, but at the time there may be 40 or 50. I would take that email and I would forward it to our CEO. And I would say, hey, I know that you really love to see when clients are happy.
That's amazing.
And so I just wanted, this email made my day. I thought it would make you happy too. Thank you for all the opportunities I have to do work that is meaningful and impactful.
And Rachel, here's a revision for the person who sent that note. Send it to the CEO and boss and forward it to you or CC you after, right? Like I try to do that more because I do think like our first instinct is Rachel's done a great job. Let me write to her. Yeah. No, write to Rachel's boss. Yeah. Copy her or forward Rachel the note later. That's another amazing way to be an advocate.
And it's so meaningful and it takes no effort. It takes like next to no effort. It just takes intentionality to do something like that and thoughtfulness. And Angela says, who else should know about my work? I'm writing that on a Post-it note right now so I can remember it.
Yes, so, seriously. Any project you're working on, who else that is at a higher level than you needs to know about it?
Yeah. Like what person of influence? And there's a study by Catalyst that I often mention in the work that I do that found that one of the fastest ways for women to advance in their careers is to make their accomplishments known and to connect to people in positions of influence.
Yes.
Like to get like those are 2 things that women are often afraid to do. It's like, don't toot your own horn, you know, don't tell people about these things that you're doing because they'll think you're too big for your britches. And it's like, well, if I don't speak up about this and no one's advocating for me, how's anyone going to know?
And you have to be intentional. For me, it was never going to happen through happy hours. I'm not really a big drinker. It wasn't going to happen through golf, right? It wasn't going to happen through car racing, which was another company I was at. Right? Those weren't the ways at sports, right? Those were not natural points of connection. So I had to actually take the time to set up coffees on people's calendars, like you're saying. Yeah, meeting people of influence so I could meet them and talk to them about my work.
Yeah, and it's like we have to take that initiative.
Yes.
And you've done that so well. And I'm excited for part 2 because this went by way too fast.
Oh, thank you so much. I can't wait for your book. I'm sure your journey is going to be very different than mine. And I'm very excited for you to come out.
Thank you so much. And everyone check out as a follow, where can people, I know LinkedIn, certainly they can connect with you. Is there anywhere else that people should follow you?
Yeah, don't go on my defunct TikTok channel. I know Liam's going to be mad because I should be on TikTok, but I have an Instagram and LinkedIn, and you can find the book on Amazon or your local independent bookstore.
It's really good. Like,
thank you so much.
It's a really great book. It's well written. It's actionable. It's insightful. It's emotional. It's funny. It's like, it's all the things. Angela's already coming back for part 2. We're excited to hear that.
Thank you. I can't wait for a part 2. Anytime, I'll be back.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We will be back in 2 weeks for our next show. We've got an exciting lineup of guests. I'll be sharing more online about that over the next few weeks. But again, Mita Mallick, thank you again for being the human that you are, doing the work that you do. And we will see you back on the show at some other point in 2024. We'll get that worked out.
Yes, I can't wait. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. All right. Bye, everybody.